smoothing it.
Bam. Well, I know it's been a while since I've done any videos, but I'm excited about the one I have for you guys today. I want to share with you a new knife that I recently made, and hopefully at the same time show you that you don't have to be a professional knife maker and have a lot of expensive tools to be able to make a good quality knife that should perform well in any bushcraft or survival scenario and serve you well for years to come. Now, you know, as much as I like being out here in the woods and practicing bushcraft and survival, the truth is I only get to spend part of my time doing that. I'm just like many of you. I have bills, and that dictates that I have a regular job to pay those bills and support my gear addiction, and I haven't found a way to do that out in the woods as of yet. With that being said, I've often thought it would be great to have a full tang fixed blade knife that would perform 90% of the same task as my larger knives, yet at the same time be small enough and comfortable enough to wear every day. I kind of put that idea on the back burner for about a year until another video that I watched relit those fires of creativity. Now, that video channel was The Art of Craftsmanship. By the way, if you haven't seen any of their videos, go check them out. Dustin and Devin O'Hara put together some awesome videos. Anyway, this particular video I saw was of Dustin making a leather sheath for a bushcraft knife that he had made, and it impressed me and also encouraged me to the point of going ahead and diving in to make this knife just so that I could try my luck at making the sheath too. So let me show you what I'm calling the Mill Creek Bushbuddy and give you not only its specs but also share with you some of the steps that went into making it. First of all, I wish I had documented this build, but it was one of those projects that kind of snowballed and took on a life of its own, and by the time I even considered making a video of it, I was already well into finishing it. I have included a few clips of other knives I've made just to help explain the process, since I basically made this knife using those same steps. So let me start with how I came up with this particular design. After looking at many other knives online and trying to decide exactly how big I wanted this knife to be, I found myself coming back to the Bravo EDC made by Bark River for its overall shape and dimensions. I decided to base my knife around those same basic dimensions. Now, this knife is made from a Nicholson file. It has a Rockwell hardness of 57 to 58. It has an overall length of 6 1/2 inches with a blade length of 3 1/8 inches and a handle length of 3 3/8 inches. The overall width is 15/16 inches at the widest point. The scales are desert iron wood with white and sunset orange G10 liners. The blade is 140 thousandths thick. It has a sharpened spine and a saber grind with a secondary bevel. I started out by drawing the basic shape of the handle and blade on a piece of cardboard, and then I cut it out to use as a template. I began the work on the file by flat grinding off all the teeth to get a good flat surface for the layout. This is surprisingly more easy than you think, as the disappearing lines of the teeth provide a good gauge as to where you need to concentrate your grinding. Once this was done, I used a layout die called Dicom on the file to make my lines more vivid, and I scribed around the template. You could also use a fine point Sharpie to trace around the contour, I guess, and I have used larger Sharpies in place of the Dicom before to enhance the scribed lines. You just have to remember that these lines have to remain on there long enough to finish grinding the outside shape of the contour. Once I had the contour laid out, I began cutting away the excess material using a cutoff wheel and a die grinder, making sure I didn't overheat the file, which would affect the hardness. Once this was done, I could go to the belt sander and finish grinding the contour. Any smaller radius points I finished with a Dremel using a small drum sander. At this point, I tempered, or what we call drawed back the material, placing it in a 500-degree oven for 2 hours and allowing it to cool to room temperature, and then repeated that process in what we call a double draw. This removes the brittleness of the file and draws the hardness back to a more suitable level for a blade. Next, I drew out where I wanted my pins and drilled 2 holes using a 1/4 inch solid carbide drill. This is where the major difference comes into play when you don't begin by annealing the blade back to a soft state first. Doing so would allow you to use regular high-speed steel drills and make the material a little easier to work with. But it would also mean that you would have to re-harden the blade when you were done. Now personally, I found it easier to leave the blade in a hard state and use solid carbide drills that anyone can purchase online. After drilling the liners and scales, one side at a time using the pre-drill blade for a guide, I then added the 1/8 inch glue holes, drilling through both liners and only slightly into the scales to assure good glue penetration and adhesion. Once I had all the holes drilled, I began grinding the side bevels of the blade using a homemade jig and my 1 inch by 30 inch Harbor Freight belt sander. Scribing lines at 1/8 inch intervals from the cutting edge provided a good guide for keeping the bevels even on both sides while I was grinding. Always being careful not to get the blade too hot by cooling it occasionally in a bucket of water. Now, I completely finished the blade at this point, and I wrapped the cutting edge in tape to protect its finish and not to mention me. Gluing the handle scales and liners was done using G-Flex 5-minute epoxy. Now you could use other epoxies, that's just the kind that I used. I clamped it and allowed it to cure overnight. I might add that the very front edge of the scales were finished before the actual gluing process, since this is the only area you couldn't sand afterwards without grinding into your blade. Finishing the handle was done by drawing out the final contour and sanding everything down to the finished blade, beginning with about 100 grit belt on the belt sander and ending with 1500 grit and double-aught steel wool by hand, followed by a quick buffing and oiling. Making the sheath for this knife was a really fun project. As I stated earlier, it was the video of making the sheath that actually spurred me on to start this knife project. I used basically the same method as Dustin did when making his sheath. I'll do my best to include a link to that particular video in the comments below. I purchased all of the items I needed to make this sheath on eBay, including things like the groover and the beveling tool, as well as the gum tragacanth and the leather die. So after tracing the outline of the finished knife onto the leather and adding about 3/8 inches for the welt, I cut out the sheath and dyed it with the leather dye. Then I glued in the welt using contact cement once I was satisfied with the fit. After beveling the edges and grooving one side of the threads, I marked the thread placement using an old sharpened fork. Then it was as simple as pre-drilling the holes, threading it up, and then burnishing the edges with the gum tragacanth to give it a very professional, slick look. I was really satisfied when it was all said and done. I was a little concerned that it was going to be too small before I laced it up, but now that it's all said and done, I wouldn't want it to be any more loose than what it is. Well folks, as I said in the beginning of the video, I hope I've encouraged at least some of you to dive into making your own knife, as well as maybe even the sheath. If you take your time and you don't get in a big hurry, you'll be surprised at how much you can do with just a few tools, some of which you might even already own. I know I'm really pleased with how well this knife turned out, and I look forward to breaking it in now that I've made this video. Hey, thank you for watching the video. If you liked it, give it a thumbs up, comment or subscribe. God bless each of you, and I'll be back with another video as soon as I can. Remember to be prepared, not only for this life, but the eternity that lies beyond. God bless you.
Well, I was born down in the Southland 20-some odd years ago. I ran away for the first time